Hello friends, I welcome you back to my YouTube channel. In this video, we'll simply be talking about the posterior pituitary gland. In our previous video on this topic, we talked about the anterior pituitary gland, the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and the action of those hormones like growth hormones. So please, if you've not seen that video on the anterior pituitary gland, I encourage you to do that by clicking on the link that will drop shortly. And also you can go to the playlist on endocrinology and also see the videos. So in this particular video, we're going to talk about the posterior pituitary gland, the parts of the posterior pituitary gland, hormones of the posterior pituitary gland, where they are secreted, the actions of these hormones on various parts of the body. We'll also look at the clinical presentation like diabetes insipidus as regards to these hormones. We'll also look at some of the reflexes that are associated with these hormones like milk ejection reflexes. So having said that, let's now go straight and talk about the posterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland is one of the parts of the pituitary gland. It is also called the neurohypophysis. It has three parts, and these parts consist the pars nervosa, which you can also call the infundibular process. The second part is the neural stalk, or you can call it the infundibular stem, whereas the third part is the median eminence. Like we said in our previous video, we made mention that the pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus through hypophyseal stalk, or you can call it the pituitary stalk. And this hypophyseal stalk or pituitary stalk is formed by the pars tuberalis of anterior pituitary gland and the neural stalk of the posterior pituitary gland. Now let's go straight and talk about the tissues and cells found in the posterior pituitary gland. So we are going to talk about the histology of the posterior pituitary gland. When you hear histology, it's basically the tissues, the cells that are found in the particular organ or in particular structure. As for the cells of the posterior pituitary gland, it is made up of neural types of cells, which are called the pituitcytes and the unmyelinated nerve fibers. Unmyelinated nerve fibers are just nerve fibers that is not covered with myelin sheath. Alright, so let's talk about the pituitcytes. The pituitcytes are the fusiform cells that are derived from the glial cells. Fusiform cells are just the cells that has a tapering end. Okay, so it has a tapering end. So the pituitcyte is derived from the glial cells. Alright, and these cells has a whole lot of processes and brown pigments also. So the pituitcytes are supporting cells and they do not secrete any hormones. They are just supporting cells of the posterior pituitary gland, so they don't secrete any form of hormones. Then as for the unmyelinated nerve fibers, they come from the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei of hypothalamus through pituitary stalk or through the hypophyseal stalk. The pituitary stalk and the hypophyseal stalk are just the same thing. Okay, so let's now talk about other structures. There are some other structures that are found in the posterior pituitary gland. It is not just the pituitcytes and the unmyelinated fibers. Structures like the blood vessels, the hyaline bodies, the Neuroglia cells, and the Mast cells are also found in the posterior pituitary gland. Alright, so let's talk about the hormones that are found in the posterior pituitary gland. Unlike the anterior pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary gland does not secrete its hormone. Alright, the hormones of the posterior pituitary gland is secreted by the hypothalamus and then conveyed down to the posterior pituitary gland, okay, through nerve fibers of hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Alright, so these hormones are just two in numbers. They are the antidiuretic hormones, which you can also call the vasopressin and the oxytocin. Alright, Like I said earlier on, these hormones of the posterior pituitary gland are not secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. They are simply secreted by the hypothalamus and then conveyed to the posterior pituitary gland through nerve fibers of hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract by means of axonic flow. Alright. So there are special proteins that helps in transporting these two hormones from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland, and these hormones are known as the neurophysins. Okay, they are called the neurophysins. In the posterior pituitary gland, these two hormones, the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormones, are stored in nerve endings. So whenever an impulse that is coming from the hypothalamus gets to the posterior pituitary gland, it stimulates the posterior pituitary gland to release these hormones into circulation, into blood circulation. So blood now carries it to the target organs. So these two hormones are referred to as neurohormones. Okay, reason being that they are only released when an impulse comes from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland. So they will be released from the nerve endings where they are stored temporarily until the hypothalamus gives an instruction that they should be released in circulation. So an experimental evidence to prove this fact that these hormones are actually stored in the nerve endings is when you cut the pituitary stalk, you will find out that these hormones will be dripping from this cut end of the nerve endings. Okay, so that is what you use to prove that actually these two hormones are stored in the nerve endings of the posterior pituitary gland. All right. These special proteins that helps in transporting the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone, let's discuss about it. Let's talk about it a little bit. The special proteins are the neurophysins, and these special proteins are the binding proteins that transport the antidiuretic hormones and the oxytocin from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Okay, the neurophysin does not only help the transfer of these hormones from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland, they also help to store this hormone also in the posterior pituitary gland. All right, so there are two types of neurophysin. We have the neurophysin 1, which you can also call the oxytocin neurophysin. The reason why it is called the oxytocin neurophysin is because they are the binding proteins of oxytocin. And also we have neurophysin 2, which you can also call the antidiuretic hormone neurophysin. Reason being that they bind the antidiuretic hormones. Okay, so let's talk about the antidiuretic hormone properly. Okay, let's talk about the source of its secretion, the chemistry and its half-life, and also its actions. As for the source of antidiuretic hormone, it is secreted by the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus and also in small quantity by the paraventricular nucleus. From this point of secretion, which is the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus, these hormones will now be transported to the posterior pituitary gland by the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, okay, by an axonic flow, all right, by means of an axonic flow. So let's talk about the chemistry and the half-life of this hormone. So the half-life of antidiuretic hormone is just about 18 to 20 minutes. What it simply means is just the time required for half of antidiuretic hormone to be metabolized. Alright, time required for it to lose half of its action. It's just about 18 to 20 minutes. Antidiuretic hormone, as you know, it's a polypeptide, so it contains 9 amino acids. Let's talk about the action of antidiuretic hormone. There are two basic functions of antidiuretic hormone. One, they help in the retention of water, and the other one is as a vasopressor. It has a vasopressor action. Okay, so let's talk about the retention of water. So the major function of antidiuretic hormone is to retain water simply by acting on the kidneys. So the facultative reabsorption of water is increased by antidiuretic hormone from the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts of the kidneys. When there is no antidiuretic hormone, the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct becomes impermeable to water. It does not allow water to pass through. So because of this impermeability of water through the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule as a result of absence of antidiuretic hormone, the reabsorption of water does not happen in the renal tubules, and then diluted urine will now be excreted instead of urine that is concentrated. Okay, this leads to lost amount of water through urine. Okay, so much water will now be lost from the body system through urine. Instead of some amount of water to be reabsorbed, it will now be loosed from the body through urine. Okay, so this condition is what is called the diabetes insipidus. Okay, it's a clinical condition that is associated with this antidiuretic hormone. So the main clinical condition that is associated with this antidiuretic hormone is diabetes insipidus. So what is diabetes insipidus? It's just loss of large amount of water from the body. The body can no longer reabsorb, the kidney can no longer reabsorb water. Okay, so like we said, the antidiuretic hormone helps to increase the facultative reabsorption of water from the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So when there is absence of antidiuretic hormone, the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct becomes totally impermeable to water. So it will lead to water to be excreted from the body. So this will now result to non-reabsorption of water, okay, and then bring about the excretion of dilute urine. It leads to large loss of water from the body through urine. So this is what diabetes insipidus is all about. Okay, this condition also brings about diuresis, which is excretion of large amounts of water. Okay, that is what diuresis is. How then does this antidiuretic hormone act on the renal tubules? So antidiuretic hormone acts on renal tubules by what? By regulating the water channel proteins that is known as the aquaporins through V receptors. It increases the reabsorption of water in this tubular epithelial membrane. Okay, so that is how the antidiuretic hormone acts. Okay, that is its mode of action on the renal tubules. It simply regulates the water channel proteins that is called the aquaporins. All right, so let's now talk about another action of antidiuretic hormone, which is the vasopressor action. Okay, when there is large amount of antidiuretic hormone, it shows vasoconstrictor actions, particularly causes constriction of arteries in all parts of the body, not just in a particular part of the body, but all parts of the body. So due to this vasoconstriction, blood pressure will now increase. Okay, so antidiuretic hormone is able to act on blood vessels through a receptor known as the V1A receptor. So that is the receptor that antidiuretic hormone acts on blood vessels. Although the amount of antidiuretic hormone that is required to cause the vasopressor effect is far higher than the amount required to cause the antidiuretic effect. So as for the antidiuretic effect, the amount of antidiuretic hormone that is required for it is just very small, and that of vasoconstriction effect, which is the vasopressor action of this antidiuretic hormone, the amount of hormone required for it is higher than that required for antidiuretic effect. Let's talk shortly about the regulation of this antidiuretic hormone, the regulation of its secretion. The antidiuretic hormone secretion basically depends on the volume of blood fluid and also on the osmolarity of the body fluid too. The basic stimulant for antidiuretic hormone are two. The first one is when there is a decrease in the extracellular fluid volume, and the second is when there is an increase in the osmolarity concentration in the extracellular fluid too. Let's talk shortly on the roles of osmoreceptors. Okay, osmoreceptors are just those receptors that give responses whenever there is change in the osmolar concentration of blood. So once there is a slight change in osmolar concentration of blood, then it is these osmoreceptors that conveys the response, that gives response. So where these osmoreceptors are situated in the paraventricular nuclei and the supraoptic nuclei. Around this nuclei, remember that this nuclei is located in the hypothalamus, so they are situated near the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei. When the osmolar concentration of blood increases, the osmoreceptors are now activated. Alright, so immediately the osmolar concentration of blood is increased, this osmoreceptor is activated. Alright, so in turn, the osmoreceptor stimulates the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei to send a motor impulse to the posterior pituitary through the nerve fibers that we mentioned earlier on, and they cause the release of antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone on its own will now cause the reassumption of water from the renal tubules. Okay, so this will now increase the extracellular fluid volume and then bring about the restoration of normal osmolarity. Let's talk about the second hormone, which is the oxytocin. We'll look at the source of its secretion, also the chemistry and the half-life, and also its action in female and its action in male. Oxytocin is not only found in female, it is also found in male. It also has an effect on male. So let's look at the oxytocin properly. Oxytocin is secreted mainly by the paraventricular nucleus, which is located in the hypothalamus, but small quantity is also secreted by the supraoptic nucleus. Okay, so this is just a reverse of that of the antidiuretic hormone. We say that the antidiuretic hormone is secreted in large quantity by the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, and then in small quantity by the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. So once this oxytocin that is secreted by the paraventricular nucleus in large quantity and in small quantity by the supraoptic nucleus is secreted, they are transported from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Okay, the nerve fibers of this tract will now convey them to the posterior pituitary gland, where they are stored in the nerve endings at the posterior pituitary gland, waiting for the hypothalamus to give the posterior pituitary gland signal to release it into the bloodstream. Let's talk about the chemistry and the half-life of oxytocin. As for the chemistry and half-life of oxytocin just have 9 amino acids. It's also a polypeptide, and its half-life is just about 6 minutes, unlike the antidiuretic hormone, whose half-life is 18 to 20 minutes. So antidiuretic hormone lasts longer than oxytocin. Alright, so let's look at the actions of oxytocin on female. The actions of oxytocin in female. So in female, oxytocin acts on the mammary gland and the uterus. Okay, well, first of all, look at the action of oxytocin in female. We'll first of all look at the action of oxytocin in mammary gland and also the action of oxytocin in the uterus. Okay, as for the action of oxytocin in mammary gland, that is where we're going to talk about the milk ejection reflex or milk leg down reflex. Oxytocin, as we know, it acts on the mammary gland to release milk from the mammary gland. The oxytocin acts on the myeloepithelial cells that lies around the mammary gland, causing them to contract, leading to the release of milk, okay, through the duct systems of the nipple. So this is known as milk let down. So let's now talk about the milk let down reflex, or you can call it the milk ejection reflex. There are so many touch receptors that is situated on the mammary gland, especially on the nipple. So whenever the infant suckles the nipple of the mother, it stimulates these receptors. So the impulse that is discharged by these receptors is now carried by the somatic efferent nerve to the supraoptic and the paraventricular nucleus that is in the hypothalamus. This brings about the secretion of the oxytocin. So the hypothalamus on its own will now stimulate the posterior pituitary gland to release oxytocin that is stored in the posterior pituitary gland, in the nerve endings of the posterior pituitary gland. So this oxytocin will now bring about the contraction of this myoepithelial cell and milk will now be ejected. Okay, so this is known as the milk ejection reflex. This milk ejection reflex is known as neuroendocrine reflex. The reason why it is called the neuroendocrine reflex is because it is initiated by the nervous system and then completed by the endocrine system. So whenever you are asked, give an example of a neuroendocrine reflex, it is the milk ejection reflex. Okay, it's a positive feedback mechanism and not a negative feedback mechanism. Okay, so guys, I hope that this video helps us in understanding the hormones of the posterior pituitary gland and also the posterior pituitary gland properly. In our next video, we'll talk about the action of this oxytocin on pregnant uterus and also the action of oxytocin on non-pregnant uterus. We'll also look at the action of oxytocin in male. Okay,